Hi, everyone, and welcome to session B4, Strategies that Promote Diversity and Inclusion in Clinical Research. What role does the IRB play? My name is Olivia Foreman, and I am Premer's Education Program Assistant. Before we get started, I have a few quick announcements. The agenda and all conference content can be found on our online platform. The link is on this slide, and I will also put it in the chat. The platform includes links to all live sessions, on-demand presentations, slides, our virtual poster gallery and exhibit hall, and after the meeting, the session recordings. Resources are included at the speaker's discretion. As a reminder, you need to be logged in to access the site and all content. Login information was sent to you in advance of the meeting. If you experience technical difficulties during the session, please review the help desk page on the meeting site or use the discussion box. And please make sure to review the technical requirements section of the attendee homepage on the platform to ensure that your system is set up properly. During the session, please submit questions using the questions tab on your screen. And please use the discussion tab to chat with colleagues, share knowledge, and make comments. Finally, we'd like to thank our conference supporters and exhibitors for their support of this meeting. Please be sure to visit their booth pages in the virtual exhibit hall during this event. Virtual booth pages include information and resources provided by the vendors, and some vendors are offering giveaways and participating in real-time video chat. We especially want to thank our event supporters, Advara, iMedris, and WCG IRB, Tech Software, Cayuse and Prime IRB, and City Program and IRB.net. I will now turn the session over to our speakers. Information on the speakers can be found on the agenda, and I will turn it over to Laura.
Thank you, Olivia. Greetings, good afternoon, good morning for those who are joining us from the West Coast. You are in session W2B4, Strategies that Promote Diversity and Inclusion in Clinical Research. What role does the IRB play? My name is Laura Maloney. I am a program manager at the MRCT Center of the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Harvard. And I'm joined here today by Drs. David Strauss, Barbara Beer, and Tisha Johnson. By way of quick introduction, David Strauss is a senior advisor to the MRCT Center and adjunct faculty at Columbia University. He is also a psychiatrist and a bioethicist. Barbara Beer is a faculty director at the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard. She's a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and a hematologist oncologist. She's also the director of the Regulatory Foundation's Ethics and Law program at the Harvard Clinical and Translational Sciences Center. And lastly, Tisha Johnson, she is a deputy director and chief operating officer of Yale Center for Clinical Investigation and the associate director for clinical research for Yale School of Medicine. She provides leadership and direction in clinical research in both of these roles. Next slide. So just next slide, sorry.
Yes, it's not, oh, there we go.
There we are, thank you. By way of disclosure, the views and documents that are presented in this presentation are those of the authors and do not imply endorsement or reflect the views or policies of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration or the affiliated organizations or entity of any member who contributed to this work. Individuals have served in their own individual capacity, and the MRCT Center is supported by voluntary contributions and grants. Next slide, thanks. So for those of you who do not know the MRCT Center, our vision is to improve the integrity, safety, and rigor of global clinical trials. We are a research and policy center at Harvard and the Brigham and Women's Hospital. And we do our work by engaging and convening a diverse set of stakeholders from industry to academia, CROs, government and institutional regulatory bodies, patient and patient advocacy groups, and others by addressing emerging issues in clinical trials. We work with our stakeholders as a collective to analyze the problems and propose solutions. And it's important to us that we don't just chat about the problems and kind of walk around in circles, but that we actually together create and implement ethical, actionable, and practical solutions. And over the past decade, we just had our 10-year anniversary. The MRCT Center's efforts have contributed to the implementation of best practices, increased transparency and safety for participants in clinical research. And the majority of our resources are freely available on our website for download. And next slide. Yeah, excuse me. So for most of us here, we are pretty well aware that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought health disparities to the forefront of our nation. And that, and the data here actually only shows a select part of that story. This set of data, it's taken from the AMP Research Lab. They update their data on a monthly basis. So this is reflective of November 10th. They're releasing data tomorrow. So you can look at trends over time if you want to go onto their website tomorrow. But basically what it shows is that when you adjust for age, there's a widening mortality gap between race and ethnicity within this pandemic. And we don't know the exact answer for this. It could be social determinants of health. It could be comorbidities. But either way, the take-home message is that there is a disproportionate amount of death in non-whites. But this is also not a new phenomenon in health or clinical research. So this is data from the FDA Trial Snapshots 2019. It shows that there is a disproportionate percentage of whites reflected in clinical research, not only in the United States, but actually globally. And so we're really at this pivotal point in time where we have a disparity facing us and we have underrepresentation facing us that we have an opportunity to take advantage of. Next slide. And so just by way of background, clinical trials need to be, are needed to be available to develop new diagnostics, treatments, and vaccines. And they need to reflect the population at large, but more specifically, the population that are affected by disease or those who are intended to use the intervention. We cannot assume that all individuals respond equally or similarly to interventions. And while race and ethnicity are often biological determinants used in research, or used as proxies for biological determinants in research, they are not biologically defined. And it's really the fact that social determinants of health have a real impact on biology. And diverse representation in clinical research is not simply a matter of biology, but it's a matter of health equity, fairness, and public trust. And lastly, that representation is also fundamental to reliable and generalizable research. Next slide. Yeah, so the work that the MRCT Center has been prioritizing over the last 3 years started in 2017, and it evolved over time into the production of a guidance document titled Achieving Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity in Clinical Research. This is a comprehensive guidance document that outlines the case for diversity through social justice and health equity. It also identifies and presents barriers and actionable solutions and recommendations that can be made to tackle diversity in clinical research from an ethical, scientific, and practice standpoint. But we could not have done the work without our leadership, including David and Barbara, and the continuous effort of the MRCT Center staff. And while we might have led the work as the center and as a leadership team, it was really the invaluable input and contributions of the work group members that made the guidance document possible. And we had over 40 different individuals representing different groups that contributed to this work. And it's available again on that website that you see on your screen for free download. We are also anticipating publishing this, so stay tuned in the coming weeks for the guidance document and its toolkit on Amazon. Next slide. And in the document, we take this very broad approach to diversity. So it's not just age, ethnicity, sex, or race. We want others to understand that there are many dimensions that intersect with one another for diversity. They're not independent variables, and that each needs to be considered within the definition of diversity. Next slide. And in the guidance document, as I mentioned, it's reflective of multi-stakeholder contributions and consensus. It provides practical and actionable recommendations, and it also has a toolkit that has adaptable resources that are not easily found elsewhere. But important for our conversation today, it has an accountability section that identifies each of the stakeholders, as you can see in this wheel, and how they can make change to this paradigm. Today's focus will be on the IRB and ethics committees, but mostly IRBs. And we will now discuss how they have responsibility in ensuring diverse and appropriate representation in clinical research. And with that, David, I'm going to hand it back over to you. So thank you for running my slides.
Thanks, Laura. I'm going to actually segue into my talk by using the same diagram from Laura's last slide to make the point that there are indeed many stakeholders and many entities that play a critical role in the clinical research enterprise and along the pathway of new treatment development. And those include, of course, sponsors and funders and CROs, research institutes, investigators, healthcare professionals, participants, patients, and their advocate, the regulatory agencies, and journal editors. And I think the key message for us is that in their own way, each is uniquely responsible for fostering or promoting the goals of diversity, number one, and that within their domain, they have specific duties and specific opportunities to promote diversity in clinical research. But each is also responsible to the greater whole. And we like to think that each is accountable to others along the pathway, this clinical development life cycle, so that their partners in research are accountable to them and they to their partners. And that, as a way of thinking about it, is one of the ways that collaboration and cooperation occurs. No stakeholder can do it alone. And I underscore this in this conversation today, because while we're going to talk about the role of IRBs, we certainly do not believe that IRBs can do it alone. We will argue, however, that the IRBs have unique responsibilities and important responsibilities in this regard. So what's the problem to solve? Well, in a simple way, and these are some take-home points that I think are important today. In the most simple way, the nature of the problem, we believe, is both a scientific and an ethical one. And that aligns very much with the way we think about the work and role of IRBs. From an ethical perspective, or from a scientific perspective, I guess I'll start there, underrepresentation of individuals and communities or groups by age or sex or gender identity or race and the other categories that Laura mentioned really has implications for the evidence base, the knowledge base upon which treatment and individual and group treatment decisions are made. It also has implications for public policy, as the coronavirus pandemic has underscored for us. From an ethical perspective, this shortcoming in the resulting evidence base has specific implications for fairness and access to treatment, and what we commonly refer to as health equity or equity in healthcare. Is a role for the IRB justified? Well, I'd like to argue today, and we make the point here, that this is not a new role for the IRB, that the notion of attending to equity in inclusion in clinical research is embedded in the ethical framework upon which IRB work rests, number one. And two, that while it may in many instances be under-recognized and under-implemented, attention to diversity in clinical research by ethics committees and IRBs is certainly not new, although it may not be uniform and the approaches may not be consistent. Finally, what practical steps can be taken? Now, I'm going to lead into a talk where Barbara is going to lay out some tools and specific approaches for IRBs. But to start off or to frame it, let me just say that I think it's really important that an IRB, its members and its leadership and the institutions in which it sits, if it sits in an institution, recognize that diversity matters, and they need to understand why it matters, both from the scientific perspective and from the ethical perspective. So the first practical step in my estimation, is to understand why diversity matters and to make a case for it for your institution and your IRB. The second is how to develop and implement practical steps. We've already heard today about drug trial snapshots, and I think the startling facts are, if you look at this data from 2015, is that in this instance, African Americans are significantly underrepresented. In my view, sometimes thinking about them as being understudied takes home the point. It's not about representation, it's about that they're not included in the science and in the research. If you look at other data, summary data, and this is from 2019, the same drug trial snapshots, you see that in a treatment of prostate cancer, both African Americans and Hispanic populations are understudied. If you look at treatment of breast cancer, the representatives from African American communities are vastly underrepresented. And in schizophrenia, as just one case in point, you can see that no one over age 65 is included in the research. Maybe we'll have time to talk about that later, but it's really hard to justify that based either on science or ethics. But I want you to, as IRB members or staff, to imagine for a moment that you're asked to review a multi-center trial of an investigational agent for the treatment of prostate cancer. This is from trial snapshots, but imagine this prototype. And the question is, if you were presented with demographics that look like this, what is your role and what's your obligation as an IRB to address it? And I guess I would ask as a first question, does your IRB even collect information in research proposals that would allow you to understand the proposed demographics? We know that prostate cancer, for example, is highest among African Americans. We know that African Americans are twice as likely to die. And we know that increased risks associated with low or socioeconomic status and unequal access to care has implications for outcome. So the question is, how does the inclusion or failure to include African Americans in a research population have implications for the ethical work of the IRB? Well, inclusion is important. Analysis of group differences in safety and efficacy among diverse populations can promote identification of both underlying biological factors and socially relevant factors that affect health and the social determinants of health. We'll come back and talk about beneficence in a minute. We also recognize that fairness in the distribution of the benefits of the research requires inclusion. If a population simply isn't attended to during the collection and study of a phenomenon or a disorder, we can't comfortably say that their special needs, if they exist, whether those are social determinant related or biological, can be addressed. And then finally, if you're of a population that hasn't been studied, then I think that it's hard for you to feel trusting that the clinical research enterprise has served your needs and that the treatment that you're choosing to take and that your doctor is choosing to give you works for you or will work for you. Under IRB approval of research, we know that we're required under 111.3 to make sure and to document that selection of subjects is equitable. We normally associate this idea with the principle of justice from the Belmont Report. Who ought to receive the benefits of research and bear its burdens? Moral requirements are that there be fair procedures and outcomes in the selection of research subjects. And finally, that an injustice occurs when some benefit to which a person is entitled is denied without good reason. And all of these points argue quite precisely, in my view, for a notion of fairness in terms of who gets studied in research, who is included, who is excluded for reasons that aren't justifiable. And this speaks to the work of review within the IRB. How do these standards get met? Similarly, beneficence, which we're aware of, addresses both the individual in research studies. How do we ensure that the individual participant is subject to more benefit than harm? But Belmont talks about investigators and members of their institutions are obliged to give forethought to maximization of benefits. And this applies both to members of the larger society and the longer term benefits of research that may result. So inclusion also optimizes the value that derives from research on a larger level. Finally, respect for persons obligates us to treat individuals as autonomous agents. and obligates us to protect those with diminished autonomy. And this applies as we begin to examine some of the common impediments to research participation for certain traditionally or typically understudied and included groups. If the research procedures, which an IRB needs to attend to, aren't designed with the community that they're seeking to recruit in mind, then the notion of access, the notion of consent, and the notion of engagement are flawed. People don't participate in research if they're not appropriately and informed about research, and that consent and engagement isn't tailored to their specific needs. So if we think about the application of the Belmont report, it may sound like what I'm talking about is a new angle on it, this focus on inclusion. But in fact, ethics and protection from research risk is where we focused primarily before. It wasn't that inclusion wasn't on the table. Ethics and protection of research risk arose because our research enterprise arose from stories of scandal and exploitation in research, and our emphasis was on protecting people from risk. In the 80s, in the context of the HIV epidemic, ethics and access to the direct benefits of novel investigational drugs became a new focus. And people increasingly ask, don't protect me. We want to be able to directly benefit from what research has to offer. Now we're talking about a new concept in this evolution of progress, although it's not a new concept in the principles that underlie the work of IRBs. And it says that ethics, inclusion, and access to the benefits of scientific knowledge are where the emphasis and thrust of ethical review should sit at the current moment. With that, I will hand it over to Barbara.
Thanks very much, David, and thank you, Laura. So I'm going to be pivoting now to sort of the practical implications of the thesis that David laid out, that there is a role for the IRB in reviewing for diversity and inclusion in research, and that is to ensure ethical research is, as the primary role of the IRB, is thoughtful in this dimension. I also think that the IRB, for its institutions, creates expectations and promotes dialogue. It establishes an accountability and sort of has a role in providing oversight for that accountability, and often is the group that is, as a human research protection program, fostering competence, education, and development of resources and infrastructure for the investigators and their study team. I will return to this, but I think that it's very important for the institution to support the role and responsibility of the IRB. And it's certainly a responsibility of the Human Research Protection Program, in addition to the IRB committee itself. You know, many people say this is scope creep. We think it's absolutely within the jurisdiction and responsibility of the IRB. It's going to be challenging to sort of bring that perspective across the finish line. And importantly, we think it's important to ask the question. If you simply ask the question, I believe and we believe that we will start to see change. And I know Tisha will talk about that and follow me. Could I have the next slide? So it starts with the demographics and overall recruitment plan that an IRB should look at. So what is the optimal recruitment target? As Laura pointed out, it's based on an understanding of the epidemiology of the disease or for whom the product is intended. If you don't know anything about that, then probably that is one of the first steps, but also one should then parallel the general distribution in the population or those affected by the disease. But of course, if that's the intended population of a clinical trial, there are many instances where one wouldn't want to start with those affected by the disease or for whom the product will be intended. And the initial phase 1 healthy volunteers are a good example. If you're doing a 10-person exploratory study, that is not something where you can get adequate representation. You may be in an area or a district where you cannot recruit a sufficiently diverse population. And if that's the case, then one should at least think about how you're going to use the data and results from that clinical trial to generalize those findings across the population. And maybe that is one thing that should be thought about in anticipation of the importance of the clinical trial approvability and whether it should be a multi-site trial. So we take the position that if you're going to deviate from the recruitment target, there are many reasons why that's okay, but those exceptions should be justified and documented. And that's a responsibility of the investigator, the study sponsor, and it starts from the assumption and defense of the recruitment target, but then the study protocol should contain information about the demographics of the disease and for those for whom the product is intended, and prior research relevant to the current study. There's a trial we know now that's going on for Black and Hispanic women with breast cancer because they have been understudied compared to white women in the past. Simply saying that that is the reason for targeting this population is a justifiable reason for deviation, but it should be advertent, not inadvertent or assumed. Could I have the next slide? So as one looks at the initial review, the study aims and study selection should, as we said, include the demographics of the proposed sample relevant to the population affected by the condition or for whom the intervention is intended. If it does not, could you go back? If it does not, is the deviation adequately justified? Sometimes, as I mentioned, there is a plan for under or over representation by one or more demographics, age, race, ethnicity, gender. And in that case, is the sample scientifically justified? And then is there a statistical plan for examining heterogeneity in outcome or across subgroups? Will it be powered? Many times it is not powered for an evaluation of the subgroup, but one should see a statistical consideration of that and understand it. And certainly there can be a trending analysis that occurs. And then importantly for the study aims and study question, have the investigators or sponsors engaged with the community and patient population, even in terms of optimizing the study conduct and the study questions. Have the comments been solicited? Have they been listened to, and have they been incorporated? And even if they are not incorporated, why not? So there's a fair amount to think about in initial review. Next slide. Secondarily, the criteria for inclusion and exclusion. Will the eligibility criteria inadvertently or unnecessarily result in under or over representation of understudied groups? We've recently seen this re-examination of the renal function calculations for Black African Americans and revising our entire normogram based on the fact that we made assumptions for normalcy that did not include that population, taking a white normative approach to that data. And the fact that our genetic database and many of our databases are, as it were, privileged to the white population makes it important that we think about how these inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria matter. The alternative approaches to minimizing risk that do not rely on exclusion, have they been considered? In other words, if you're worried about age, are you worried about frailty or age? Are you worried about polypharmacy or age? Are you worried about additional comorbidities? And maybe specifying those would allow advancing age in studies where they should be included. And then have recruitment procedures considered specific approaches to engaging underserved populations. And where are the advertisements going to be positioned? What do we know about how the community is engaged in those populations? And where should we be recruiting from? All of which one can do in advance of a trial and should be thought about in advance of a trial. Could I have the next slide? In study conduct, as the IRB reviews the study conduct, are the study procedures flexibly organized to accommodate the needs of the underrepresented groups? In other words, have the study clinic hours been amended to allow before work or after work? Have the number of blood draws been minimized? Have we used telehealth and telemedicine to the extent that we can to reduce burden on the populations, not only for underrepresented groups, but for everyone? And do all participant facing materials conform to health literacy principles? Are they translated? Are they culturally and linguistically appropriate? And if not, why not? And what can one do about that? We believe that no participant should suffer and be less well off for reasons of participating in a clinical trial than not, and that payment should certainly be sufficient to cover the cost of participation. They should be reimbursed or in anticipation of the expenses. We should arrange transportation, childcare, elder care if we can. And indeed, if you can compensate for the time and burden of participation, that is appropriate. And then finally, our research results intended to be returned in a manner that meets the needs of population studied. After all, that is one of the major reasons that participants volunteer for clinical studies is to not only advance knowledge, but also to understand what happened in the study and what happened to them. Could I have the next slide? Importantly, at continuing review, there's a real opportunity to make sure that the investigators and sponsors are not waiting to the end of the study, having had the best of intentions for recruiting a diverse population, and then find that they have not, because they're putting all the data together and find that certain populations are underrepresented. So at continuing review, has the study fulfilled its planned recruitment and accrual goals given the time? Is the demographic distribution on track to approximate the study goals? And if not, have appropriate corrective actions been described? Are they likely to be successful, and are they likely to be sufficient? So that is, we always, maybe not always, but in my experience, always report on the demographics at continuing review. And very, very rarely does the IRB comment on that compared to the statistical expectation for the population at initial review. Could I have the next slide? So, it is true that you can't get a diverse population unless you ask a diverse population to enroll. And there is often the perception that Black and Brown and others will not say yes if asked, but it turns out that at least in cancer, which is where it's been well studied, the number of Black and Brown individuals that agree to participate is as a rate the same as white people, and they complete the study at the same rate. So in many ways, they're just not asked. So that is something that we need to correct, and the IRB has an ethical responsibility to make sure that we are adequately thoughtful about that. Could I have the next slide? But the IRB obviously doesn't work alone. There needs to be institutional endorsement and support of the IRB. Those policies must be there to support the positions of the IRB. And specifically, we think that a lot could be done for IRB membership to ensure that the IRB itself is diverse, that the community voice is represented. We often have one community member. We have no reason not to have more than one community member on the IRB. And that those that are not, and for everyone, we recommend cultural competence and implicit bias training. I will say that there are specific challenges in the world of single site review of multi-site trials, which we can discuss in the discussion period, and indeed in multi-site trials that are reviewed by multiple IRBs, where you don't have the information from other sites. But this is indeed an argument for a collective approach and harmonization of our processes and procedures and expectations. Could I have the next slide? So, we know that this is going to take some time, that this is not going to happen overnight, that we need metrics to understand how we're doing. And I think those metrics should be transparent. We should work together to figure out how to do this work well and be accountable. Next slide. What I don't think is that we can say there's no problem. As this cartoon says, you can plead guilty or you can plead not guilty, but you can't plead no problem. Could I have the next slide? And with that, I want to send it to Tisha, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Barbara and David and Laura, for this incredible session so far. It's a lot of pressure to be the last one in the lineup and top what you've already heard. But I'm going to try to give you a couple of examples of how this is actually being done in practice at Yale. Can I have the next slide, please? So we, years ago, really thought about recruitment and retention in a way that looked at our entire catchment area as a medical center. And as Barbara said, having the support of leadership is just incredibly important. So what you see is really the way we have this integrated approach to clinical research recruitment that involves our health system and medical center leaders, that involves our community leaders. It engages our electronic health record and our call centers and so on. And so everything is consistent. The message when you walk through the door is we intend as an academic medical center to offer innovative clinical trials options as a part of care, and then we intend to do it in a diverse way. Next slide, please. This approach has only been made possible through a partnership that we have with the community, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion, or AME Zion churches, as I'm going to shorten it to for the rest of the presentation, and an organization called Junta for Progressive Action, which is a Latino, Latinx facing advocacy organization in New Haven. And we came together about 10 years ago, really focused on having the community leaders understand the issues that Barbara and David and Laura covered so eloquently. And it resulted in an intensive bidirectional partnership with the community leaders so that they had a seat at the table, helping us to not only understand the viewpoints of the community leaders, but also advise us in our recruitment strategies, advise us in our protocols, all of the important things that you just heard from Barbara, but also in implementation issues, also thinking about those very important policy discussions that Barbara and David have and Laura have raised. But additionally, especially over the past few years, with the leadership of our Human Subjects Protection Program, our cultural ambassadors have become advisors to the IRB, in many cases helping them to really understand some of the concepts in the protocol. So the IRB has actually had consults with the cultural ambassadors as they've been developing protocols or as they've been reviewing protocols and advising investigators. Many times the IRB actually refers investigators to the cultural ambassadors program. So during review, the IRB has determined that the investigator does not have a plan that is going to yield a diverse participant pool. And they said, you need to go talk to the cultural ambassadors and you need to fix your study before we're going to review it or approve it. And so it's been an incredible partnership. that has not only helped our investigators, but in recent years really transitioned to support the IRB, and the IRB transitioning to support us in the program. The IRB was an integral part of the training of our ambassadors over the in the initial start of the program, but over the past few years has been incredibly engaged in helping us with the retraining of new ambassadors and the ongoing continual training of our ambassadors. The original members have over 200 hours of clinical research training, so they really are very special advisors to the program. Next slide, please. And what this has resulted in for us, which is this incredible view of our health system. Here it's shown by population density. So it looks like there's not a lot in the sort of northern part of the state, but fewer people live there. But this really integrated structure that has led us to 8% of the total new patient volumes coming to our health systems are coming for research. We've had a 950% increase in the total volumes of industry research, but more importantly, across our entire portfolio, 30% of the participants in our clinical trials, which is an ever-growing number, were from underrepresented populations. And where the ambassadors are personally involved, most of the studies range from the 50% to 80 or 90% underrepresented population. So it's very clear we have metrics that their engagement works, and the IRB has come to rely on that. Next slide, please. So this has also led us to an important partnership with the FDA Office of Minority Health and Health Equity, because we think that this model of engagement in the community is a model that could be replicated and support other programs, as Barbara and David and Laura are suggesting. Next slide, please. And one of the really important principles of that, I think, that also helps the IRB and also adds to this bidirectional flavor of the program is annually our ambassadors are prioritizing the work that they would like to see. So they've been very focused, as an example, on COVID-19. And so I think that the IRB has relied on them as they brought COVID studies forward to say, we understand this disease has a disproportionate impact on your population. We're seeing this study come forward. Can you give us your opinions about how this might be viewed in the community and so on? Next slide, please, David. So we've had some really important lessons to learn from this partnership, and I think some huge wins. One example that I want to share that's a very relevant to the IRB discussion that Barbara just raised is compensation. Our investigators were very focused on a homeless population for a few of the studies and said the homeless have to have cash. They cannot participate in a study where cash is not the payment option. What we learned through the partnership with the ambassadors was giving the homeless individuals cash actually made them a target at the homeless shelter. So we work very closely with the IRB, close with the ambassadors to transition all of those payments from cash to our reloadable debit card system, which the investigators argued against because homeless don't have an address, but then we work with the homeless shelters in the community and the trusted individuals, so there was a place that those cards could safely be picked up. And so I think the idea that these IRB specific kinds of issues could have a really innovative solution if you partner with the community, you partner with your IRB and your HRPP to really understand what those issues are in an in-depth way as you're reviewing the protocol. And the IRB will give better guidance that will ultimately lead to more diverse studies. I think another really great example that we have is I've shared those incredible recruitment statistics, but another thing that we're doing now is we're asking these really hard questions. So sometimes the science may be incredibly interesting to our investigators, but the question is, should you be doing it in the community? One of the examples that we had in this case was a smoking cessation study in youth. And it came to the IRB, a very interesting question on e-cigarettes. But the advertisement, in a way, the IRB felt would encourage the use among participants and youth that weren't currently using it. So they had a consult with the ambassadors. The ambassadors completely agreed. They went back to the investigator. They've redesigned the study now in a way that they feel like won't promote this. But I think that these are very concrete examples of how the IRB can help bring this cultural competency kind of aspect to the review. And then there are many other examples where the way we've coordinated research, the way we think of research, we constantly use the term clinical trial. Our community leaders have said to us that is not the right way to discuss it in their community, because trial has a legal implication. And so you want to think about it in a different way. Next slide. Another really important thing I think that the community leaders have done for us with HRPP, this is actually a live Facebook live session from a couple of months ago in the midst of COVID. You can see me with my ponytail. I should have, if I was going to use this, I knew I was going to use it for this presentation, I would have dressed up a little bit more. But in the pink sweater, that's Madeline Baranowski, the director of our IRB, and this is actually a Facebook Live Zoom session for a study that ultimately received a waiver of consent. And this is the public meeting that would have been held face-to-face. We had over 200 participants at this meeting in this Facebook Live forum, and our ambassadors had been presented with the study in advance. They helped to recruit the participants for the meeting, and it was incredibly informative for the IRB, for the investigator, and it met this very specific HRPP requirement to help us get this study live. Next slide, please. So these, I hope, I realize I'm rushing through, but we wanted to give you time to ask questions. But these, I hope, give you some very concrete examples of how you can really think through and integrate this approach that Barbara and David and Laura have laid out in a practical aspect of how the IRB does business, how you can integrate these important programs in the role of the IRB in human subject protection. So thank you. And I'll turn it back over to you, Barbara or Laura.
Thanks, Tisha. That was incredible. Actually, I learned a lot, even the vocabulary of using the word trial, that really struck a chord with me, because I think I often flip-flop back and forth between research and trial, and I think research is a better term for it. So we do have some questions that are coming in from the audience. And I think I'm first going to pitch this to the three of you, and you can battle who's going to answer it first. But the first one is, do you have any recommendations for online training for cultural competency and an implicit bias for IRB members?
So I can tell you, I know the ones I know. There's a very good Harvard-based implicit bias training. If you go to Harvard Implicit Bias, you'll get the link. I would say, and there are others, of course, I would say that sometimes this can be a very upsetting and eye-opening training when done right, because, you know, most of us who are here and on the IRB and working for the, you know, for the good of society, really, you know, are doing this with the best of intentions and a big heart. And are not aware of our own biases when we approach these things. And this training can sometimes and often has exposed undercurrents that are really important to realize in oneself. But one needs a way of discussing it afterwards and understanding it. So the most successful, I think, are those that are done not online, but rather in person, and with somebody who's skilled at the discussion and analysis in order to help people understand and then change. But, you know, something is better than nothing, but I really believe that as a new administration comes into force that has not made it impossible to do any bias training, implicit bias training as an executive order, that institutions will adopt this as an important practice.
David, do you just want to take the screen share down so that we can be more of a panel together?
Sure.
Thank you. And then this one also, to put you on the spot again, David, this one's for you, I believe. And Tisha and Barbara, as you see fit, to chime in, please. For exempt research, what role does the IRB have in being able to guide the research that is done? It seems part of the problem for exempt research is that investigators within academia aren't particularly interested in research questions involving underrepresented populations.
So, look, the activities that fall under the federal regulations and that require IRB review do not represent the entirety of clinical research, and they certainly don't represent the entirety of clinical research that we should be interested in and concerned with. And I think that the ethics of research doesn't stop because a study is considered to be exempt from IRB review. And this may be an opportunity or an area where the IRB and the institution in which the research takes place need to cooperate and collaborate. And I think there are many domains, including this one, where an institution may set policies that say, regardless of whether the study is exempt from IRB review, there needs to be informed consent. There needs to be attention to the populations that are involved in the study. There needs to be sensitivity to the benefits of community engagement. So I would just say, absolutely, exempt does not mean exempt from ethics, and it certainly should not mean exempt from diversity.
And I would add that I agree it's an institutional expectation. I would also say that if a study is funded as by the institution, it is definitely their responsibility. If it is funded by a nonprofit sponsor, NIH or other, and we would hope that as this attention to diverse representation in clinical trials proceeds, clinical research proceeds, that that the funders will be ever more alert and expect representativeness, particularly in exempt research, where one can look at novel ways to overcome the problems of the past. I think we have to do more than that in many times because our genetic basis or the genetic databases from which many of our AI algorithms are derived are 95% of European descent, which does not represent our society. So we need to do even more than we've done to correct the imbalance of the past.
I guess I want to just add one last thing, and maybe she wants to say something too. But we've talked about IRB and institutional responsibilities, and of course, we would say that ultimately the responsibility rests with the investigator. And in addition to the kinds of implicit bias training that you were talking about before, I think it's not necessarily obvious to investigators why diversity matters. And when we started this project 3 years ago at the MRCT, we found that we needed to make the case for diversity in ways that, unfortunately, in the wake of the pandemic, have become all too obvious. But I think that investigators ought to be better informed about how and why diversity matters in clinical research, and I think that I think is a duty of people who do research.
I'll just add, to that. I agree both with the comments made by David and Barbara. The one thing that I'll say to that last comment by David, it is very important for the investigators to have this training and understand why, but it's also very important for them to understand how to do it. Because I think just the referral from the IRB to say you need to engage the community, you need to engage a diverse population, if they do it in the wrong way, it'll actually harm the research and harm the broader mission. So as institutions are also introducing policies or practices that promote diversity, they also need to promote training so the investigators know how to do it in an appropriate way so that they really get the true engagement that they need to be successful over the long term. And I would say also the institution needs to have a structure that allows for that engagement to continue beyond the study, because I think that's been part of the historical problem of engagement for a specific study. The engagement ends, the relationship ends, and it's ours, the community. So it's imperative on the institution to address that and make sure that they have a sustainable relationship so that the research can continue in a way that promotes diversity.
And I'll go one step further. I couldn't agree more, but the engagement has to be authentic. It has to be prolonged or long lasting. And I think we should think about it also as what is our responsibility for investing in the community, not just engaging with the community, and supporting that which we ask of the community for our own endeavor. These are stretched resources. And every time we ask our community center or our religious group or our advisors to do one more thing for us, it means one thing they're not doing for the community that is potentially of higher priority for them. So we should be prepared to support the work that we're asking of them.
Great. And actually, to follow on with that, to you, Tisha, there was another question that came in before you were even responding, but that aligns quite nicely with this. So with the ambassador program and your suggestion about having the IRB direct them to the resources that their institution is providing, whether it's training or relationships within the community or otherwise. How was the ambassador program set up? Was it run by the IRB? And if it wasn't, can you kind of talk about the logistics of forming that?
No, it's not run by the IRB. It's embedded within our Yale Center for Clinical Investigation, or it's the home of our Yale CTSA. And so this is where it lives. But I think one of the things that institutions should think about is human subject protection is a responsibility of the entire organization. And so the way our human subject protection program is built is it's not, the IRB doesn't stand alone as an island. We actually form these partnerships. And so the IRB and even the data that we presented at accreditation was combined data. These are the services that sit within the center. These are the services that sit within the IRB structure, and this is what forms the fabric of human subject protection at our institution. And so we work quite closely with the director of the HRPP and her IRB chairs to make sure that our efforts are integrated. She actually attends a lot of the meetings. The ambassadors know both the chair and the director by first name and are willing to call on them when they have questions. But the formation of the program was set up within the center. And as Barbara said, we have a compensation model to make sure that we're helping to offset those costs in the community and add the same sustainability aspect. And so that's a part of our ongoing institutional budget to make sure that we're making those organizations whole for participation in the process. But not only that, but also in this bi-directional relationship, we're supporting initiatives and ideas that they come up with. And so I think that's another important element. It can't just be this one way. This is what we need to give you to support our research. It has to be that partnership, that these are the things that we might want to do. Once we understand these problems, we're going to have our own ideas, our own initiatives that we're going to want you to help us invest in. And you need to have the funding to do that as well. And all of those things are incorporated within our center budget.
And I would annotate that to say, as we're sort of responding to the pandemic and being out in the community more, we're also using that opportunity to provide food and testing for other, sort of background medical conditions like hypertension and diabetes, and sort of really trying to make this a win-win for the individuals as well as for the research. So I think that particularly as we invest more in health equity, as we go forward and understand social determinants of health, we also will have an obligation as institutions and as society to think through how we can address those. It's not just That's, of course, beyond the role of the IRB and even the HRPP, but we need to own this if we're going to ask the question.
Great, thank you. Unless there are any other comments, we should probably hand it back over to Olivia, who will close us out for our session.
Yes, thank you so much. Unfortunately, time is up. I know there are a couple more questions we didn't get to, but thank you so much to our speakers for a great session. Just as a quick note, conference evaluations will be sent at the end of each week, and upon completion of the evaluation, you'll be able to access your certificate of attendance. Session recordings will also be available within 5 days of the airing. And thank you so much, and have a good rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you.
So long, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.